I'm all too familiar to some of you because I've done these talks for a few years now. But to those who don't know me, I'm Alyson Wharton-Durgaryan, and I was working for the past 10 years at the University of Lincoln, but I start a new job on Monday at Oxford, so I'm very excited about that, a new chapter and a new research project. Before I was at Lincoln for 10 years, and before that I was working for 3 years in Turkey, in southeast Turkey, at Mardin University, which is in southeast Turkey, right on the border with Syria. So a lot of the material that's included in my book actually dates back to that period when I was based in Mardin. And we were very lucky in that during that period it was a period of relative stability within Turkey, although there was of course the border across which all the jihadis were passing to Syria, so there was nearby trouble, but within the southeast at that moment in time it was stable. We were able to travel around, we were able to do field work, we took our students on study trips to Diyarbakir, Gaziantep, all these cities, so it was wonderful to be able to explore during that period of relative peace. So I was able to do field work firsthand on a lot of the monuments in the cities. I became interested particularly in the 19th century monuments because I'd previously worked on 19th century Armenian architecture in Istanbul, in Constantinople. And so I increasingly started to think perhaps I could do a new project, potentially a book one day, about the cities of the Ottoman East, which is what is often called Southeast Turkey, Southeast Anatolia, or Western Armenia, to those of us here today. So I will begin. As you can see around the room, there are copies of the book that did materialise. So it came out in December last year, and it will be open access in 2 years, so it will be freely available in a couple of years on the internet. It brings together my research from those 3 years of working in Mardin and travelling around the region, and also subsequent years of return trips to do more research in the Ottoman archives, to travel around a bit more, and also to bring it together with more and more Armenian books, particularly the memory books, the Hushamadian literature that I became more familiar with in subsequent years. And also the resources of the National Archive just down the road in Kew, which I also discovered had a lot of very useful information telling us about the sort of day-to-day realities in the Ottoman East in the 19th century. So I brought them all together in the book. The book has 6 chapters that each look to different cities in Western Armenia or the Ottoman East. So it's quite expansive. You jump from Mardin in the first chapter to Antep, Aintab in the second chapter, onto Urfa, Diyarbakir, Bitlis, and then Erzurum at the end. So you could say these are all radically different locales. How do you bring together all of these cities under one title? So the book is about how Armenians in these different cities adapted to the political conditions that they faced, and the different vernacular architectural traditions, and how they blended these architectures through those political conditions with external networks that were linking them increasingly to Russia in Erzurum, or to Lebanon in Mardin, or to Iran in Gaziantep. So each chapter is about the merging of the local vernacular influences with the networks that were increasingly opening to elsewhere, and how these went through this sort of merging evolution of a style in the 19th century under these very strained political conditions, which gave rise later to the Hamidian massacres and eventually the Armenian genocide, as we all know. So there are some leaflets, or flyers rather, around where you can have a discount if you are interested in buying, but as I said, it will be open access in 2 years, so you can hang on if you want to, or visit the Hayashin Library upstairs to see their copy. So why study the architecture of this region, and why bring it together under the label of forms of belonging. What's the argument of the book? So we're all too familiar with the map of the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire from the Wharton-Durgaryan website. I'm sure you've all used that wonderful website in your own time and explored the resources that are up there. So if you don't know it, it's a website that's run by Vahe Tashtian in Berlin, and he is constantly updating it and mapping the different provinces of the former Ottoman Empire and uploading to those different geographical areas different sources. So these can be like material sources, like people's heirlooms that they've sent him photos of, or they can be textual accounts that are taken from this memory book literature, which I'll come back to later. So he's translated lots of excerpts from these memory books that tell us about former life in these localities. Other things he's done, he's uploaded songs, so you can see the screenshot at the bottom is actually a screenshot of the website itself, and that's the map of the territories that it covers. So you can see on the menu that he's uploaded songs, dances, literature, all kinds of different sources that can tell us about aspects of Ottoman Armenian society, particularly in the 19th century, early 20th century, for which the sources are more numerous. And it's largely crowdsourced, so it's largely individuals, families that are sending materials to Tashtian in Berlin, and he's uploading them with his team onto his website. So this is about sort of this website, this whole mission of Wharton-Durgaryan.org is about recreating Armenian life in the territories of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th, early 20th century, and sort of reinserting presence in those territories through culture predominantly. So the focus has been mainly on what could be called folklore, so sort of myths, stories, vernacular literature, photographs, particularly family photographs, so not so much the sort of imperial photographs that were made in Constantinople and were commissioned by the court, but more local photography studios. So it's more giving a picture of vernacular culture as opposed to, let's say, the high culture of Istanbul Armenians or Constantinople Armenians. So what I was trying to do with my book was to build on that and to talk about architecture. Because architecture actually has quite little presence on Wharton-Durgaryan. And there is a discussion of churches, there's a discussion of sort of sites in the Ottoman East or in the Ottoman provinces in the 19th, early 20th century, but there's not really an analysis of the architecture, or it's not dealt with in depth through this medium. So although there is this effort to sort of study the folklore traditions of the Ottoman East or the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian realities there hasn't really been much work on its architecture. The architecture is still relatively terra incognita in terms of these kind of memory work projects. So from efforts like Wharton-Durgaryan.org, you get a strong sense that there was a different local culture in each district, in each city, in each village. There was a strong local identity. And this was expressed through costume, through music, through other traditions, through myths, through language even. So this is coming out from this work. But when you move to the domain of architecture, it's quite often to hear people look at pictures of buildings from those territories and to question why they look the way they do. They're not accepted in the same way as expressions of local culture. So I often find when I'm discussing Armenian churches or buildings that were constructed by Armenians in this region, and the reaction is, oh, is that really an Armenian church? Why did they build in that style? It doesn't look like an Armenian church. So there's often a sort of reaction against the architecture that doesn't look the right way, it doesn't look the way that we think it should look. And there's almost a reaction that, you know, these churches look more like mosques than they look like Armenian churches. So, and this is a reaction that Vahe Tashtian has also encountered, that there is this sort of, almost a sort of aesthetic reaction against the architecture from this region and a non-acceptance of it, whereas there's a tendency to be more accommodating for other forms of culture, of vernacular culture, such as songs or dance or costumes, and their sort of regional differences. So with the book I was trying to establish this architecture as part of this local culture and to sort of delineate how it's local and the quite considerable lengths to which Armenians went, particularly architects but also patrons and other people involved in these architectural projects, to establish their locality. So that was my aim. So there's been, I'm sure most of you know this already, there's been a shocking lack of academic studies on the Armenian architecture outside of Istanbul in the past. So nearly every published work has focused on the Balyan family. I'm guilty of that as well because my first book was on them. There was this wonderful exhibition in 2010 on the Armenian architects of Istanbul that was focusing on reattributing lots of important buildings in Istanbul that were not really recognised as being works of Armenian architects as you know, important works in the history of architecture, important landmarks in Istanbul, and highlighting their Armenian agency, the agency of the Armenian architects in building these works. And since then, it's also continued since 2010 that the vast majority of studies on Ottoman Armenian cultural actors tend to be focused on Istanbul, on the photography studios in the capital, or the painters, or there's definitely a bias in Ottoman studies towards Istanbul, Constantinople, and that extends to the work on Armenians too, and Armenian culture. The few works that have been done on architecture outside of Istanbul have tended to stress the significance of the erasure of this architecture. So this book in the centre by Zeynep Keza was a great sort of groundbreaking book in terms of establishing exactly how Armenian culture had been erased and replaced by Turkish Republican developments. So she pinpointed, for instance, in Ankara, where Armenian vineyards were demolished and redeveloped into embassies, and you know, these concrete examples where architecture had been sort of bulldozed or had been repurposed into other buildings that were in the service of the Republic. So there's been a lot of work in terms of, you know, the physical repurposing and the erasure of the buildings themselves and their memory, but not so much focused studies on the architecture within the 19th century context in which it was built. So I was trying to sort of rewind before the erasure to the moments at which the buildings were conceived and how the original inhabitants viewed this architecture. There's also this huge sort of legacy of official history within the Turkish Republic. So these works were mainly published within sort of European or European funded contexts, whereas within the Turkish Republic there's a very long tradition of Turkification of Armenian historical architecture, but also non-Turkic Islamic architecture that we have to contend with. So a lot of the regional architectures that were actually quite diverse in the medieval period that were produced under, you know, Kurdish emirs or under Turkmen authorities were sort of viewed as this monolithic sort of gallop towards the creation of a Turkish national architecture, and any sort of ethnic difference was just completely erased from that story. Any Christian agency, Armenian agency, Kurdish agency was completely whitewashed in terms of this was proto-Turkish architecture. There was nothing that was non-Turkish about it. So one example of that was perplexingly written actually by an Armenian who was working in the Turkish Republic called Alyson, and they were one of the most productive art historians in the Turkish Republic, very well known, and they published a number of monographs on the history of Turkish architecture, and they were one of these personalities who were responsible for Turkifying the non-Turkish medieval heritage of Anatolia. This is one of their most famous books, which focuses on Mardin. So it's called in Turkish the architecture of the Turkish period in Mardin, and it's all about the Artukid period, which was not considered to be Turkish itself, but as more recent studies have shown, such as the book by Deniz Beyazid, which is about the same architecture of Mardin that's discussed by Alyson in their book, and it's completely moving away, completely discrediting the idea that the Artukid architecture was of Turkish derivation and Turkish identity, and it's saying that actually it was a complete hybrid that brought together late antique, it brought together different Islamic influences, merging them together to create something that was unique rather than a sort of proto-Turkish ethnic category, as it was characterized by later scholars. So that's what we have to contend with a lot of studies on the architecture of different cities in Turkey and different pre-Ottoman regimes. And even in England we had, I can't remember what year it was, but there was a great big exhibition at the Royal Academy called Turks, probably 20 years ago now or something like that. And this was continuing in this tradition of you know, you go from dynasty to dynasty and style to style, and they're all inevitably leading to the modern Turkish national entity or character. So it's only very recently, surprisingly recently, that this kind of generalising, nationalising, official perspective on architecture has started to be corrected. So things get even more complicated when you get to the 19th century, because you also have paradigms like modernisation and westernisation to contend with. For a long time, the Ottoman architecture of the 19th century, whether in Istanbul or in the provinces, has been interpreted under the category of westernisation, which has implied that ever since the 18th century, when the Ottomans started direct diplomatic interactions with Europe and they established the embassy in Paris, they have been looking to European architectural styles and mimicking or imitating, growing closer. Literally, westernisation is sort of growing closer to the West, or mimicking the West in terms of the style. So there was a view that the 19th century Ottoman architecture, whether in the provinces or in Istanbul, was always trying to be closer to what the Ottomans encountered in Paris or elsewhere in Europe. And these are two sort of pivotal examples. The Nur Osmaniye Mosque, 1755. You can see from the ground plan of the mosque this characteristic horseshoe-shaped courtyard, which was totally different from the design of Ottoman mosque courtyards that you'd seen before the 18th century. So this was viewed to be a key implementation of what's called the Ottoman Baroque into Ottoman architecture, which was part of this Westernisation development. And this was viewed to be mimicking the courtyard of St. Peter's in Rome, which was a similar shape, and importing it into Istanbul. And another example is the Dolmabahce Palace, which implemented European-style palace facade architecture into the Ottoman Empire. And previous to that, all the palaces, like the Topkapı Palace, had been based around courtyards and based around this sort of Persian-style palace architecture, which was courtyards and kiosks, as opposed to this grand stone facade. So whilst there are elements of interaction between European architecture and Ottoman architecture in the 18th and 19th century, more recent scholars have moved away from this idea that Westernisation took place in that this was a sort of mimicry and that the Ottomans were trying to imitate and grow closer to Europe and to disown their own traditions. Instead, more recent studies have argued, like my own, have argued that actually there was a sort of selective appropriation of certain aspects that were useful for reformulating the imperial image in the 19th century. So this wasn't mimicry, it was, actually a very sort of targeted adaptation of Ottoman architecture and appropriation of certain technical and stylistic elements. So Another aspect is that you have this view of provincial architecture as vernacular or traditional, or geleneksel in Turkish, and there's a literature that's grown up that has sort of isolated the architecture of individual cities from the study of the Ottoman imperial architecture in the capital. So wherever you go in Turkey, every city, even plenty of villages as well, have their own book that's written about the style of architecture of that city or that village or that locale. And every city is viewed to have its own geleneksel traditional style that was made by predominantly the residential architects, as opposed to the architects of sort of state buildings that were implemented locally. So many of these works that you can find focus on house architecture, like this example, which is managing to sort of also Turkify the local or regional architectural styles. And other books, like the one in the centre, is about Urfa and is focusing on its religious architecture as a way to sort of market it for faith tourism. And to draw attention to its sort of sanctity for tourists from different religions. So in other words, there hasn't really been any academic work on these cities outside of Istanbul. So you've got this literature of vernacular architecture that's written by and large local authors, so they could be local academics in universities in the region. They could just be sort of interested amateurs who write a book on the vernacular architecture of their city. They could be like Doğan Kuban, they could be sort of experts on imperial architecture who then turn their attention to vernacular architecture and write some short studies on it. But by and large, they haven't really made any connection really between the debates in imperial architecture of the capital and local architecture. So it's only recently that you've started to have some books that have started to interpret the 19th century architecture of locales like Mardin or Diyarbakir, or shown here is Edirne, the municipality of Edirne, and a church that was built in the late 19th century. So you've started to have a whole host of new studies recently on the 19th century buildings in these localities, because it's undeniable that new buildings were constructed in the 19th century, because with the reforming state, in the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire took on a whole host of reforms, which were called reorderings or tanzimat, and through those reforms, they needed to construct a number of new building types. So they needed municipalities, they needed government houses, they needed new schools that were based on the new reformed model. They needed other new services that were appearing, that were sort of buildings that were secularizing the public space as opposed to the old focus on mosques. So new studies have studied these 19th century buildings in localities, but by and large they've tended to just interpret them again as the implementation of reforms in the locality as part of Ottoman modernization. And they've tended to interpret them in kind of generic terms as just reflective of this westernization and modernization of the 19th century generally. Or at best, implementation of centralization and more control over localities through government houses and these kind of apparatus. So, a lot of these studies haven't really dealt with the localities and the sort of the localities' individual characters and sensitivities. They've tended to just view this 19th century architecture as bringing in the locality into the orbit of the state, control over localities through rolling out uniform building types. So I was trying to see, what was actually different about the implementation of these buildings locally, what kind of local buy-in was there, what was the involvement of local architects, and in particular what was the involvement of Armenians. Because we know that Armenians by and large were the architects of the Ottoman Empire, particularly from the 18th century onwards. Before then they tended to be converted and they were working in the Imperial Architect's Office as converted to Islam. But after the 18th century, mid-18th century, Armenians were working as Christians in conjunction with the state. So it's clear that Armenians were taking on the majority of these contracted jobs in various provinces. And if you go to the Ottoman archives, you can find, if you put in a keyword search for a different locality and building works, you'll find all these Armenian names. And it's very clear within an instant that the majority of the architects were working in different districts were Armenians in the mid-18th to end of the empire, essentially. And this is mainly because of the breakdown of the Imperial Architect's Office. So previously there was a very strong sort of state tradition that was organised in the palace, and it was part of the bureaucracy for training architects, and conversion was part of this process. And so Armenians were sort of submerged within this official office, and you didn't see them so much as Armenians because they were converted. Perhaps they retained some traces of their original identity, but they weren't so visible. Whereas from the mid-18th century onwards, you start to see these names retained in the archives, you start to see their seals, there's much more evidence that they were there, and you can pinpoint the particular buildings they were involved in because there are documents where they have their seals and they're referred to. So I started to sort of think, if we can now tie Armenian architects through the Ottoman archives, even if the documentation isn't very rich because they were by and large contracted to these local architects, so the state wasn't very heavily involved, but nevertheless you can tie a name to a building in a locality. So then I was trying to draw in more evidence to try to flesh out what these Armenian architects were doing with this architecture, and what were their influences, what was their vision of them across Eastern Anatolia or Western Armenia. So I tried to sort of picture the impact that these Armenians had on actually creating the cities as we see them today, and creating a civic sense or a civic identity through their works. And I was particularly interested in the way that these architects were working with the local topography, working with local materials, and they had a very strong sense of locality that was reflected in their buildings that's often completely ignored by this interpretation of, these buildings reflect centralization or modernization. So this is one example. This is Bitlis. Has anyone been to Bitlis? I recommend, it's beautiful. And it's in southeast Turkey, Western Armenia. It used to have a huge Armenian population, but also had quite a large Kurdish population, and so there were quite a lot of tensions between those two groups. This is the municipality building that was built 1897 to 98. And there are documents, quite a lot of documents in the Ottoman archives that tie this municipality building to an architect called Arakel Kalfa. So we know from his name he was an Armenian, it's very clear. And we have the date 1897-98. So we all know that this was a very turbulent period in Bitlis's history. You just had the Hamidian massacres, which had completely decimated the Armenian population of this city. And yeah, exactly, William Saroyan was from there. And in fact, William Saroyan's account is amazing because he describes walking around the Armenian district of Bitlis, and he describes Armenian houses that have distinctive inscriptions in Armenian. So that was another period before this was built, when close to this municipality building, a couple of blocks away, there's a whole street of Armenian mansions that was built. And these mansions happen to have Armenian inscriptions of the dates, and they were built in the 1880s. So we know that there were two periods at least where Armenian architects were very active in this city. And they were building these gorgeous, very, very monumental buildings. Both the houses are 3 stories, they're beautiful, sort of cut stone with Armenian inscriptions in public, visible on the street as you pass by. We know that there were these two periods that were actually quite turbulent social, political periods for Armenians, where architects had quite strong roles apparently. So this municipality was built just after the massacres, and the massacres are normally considered where most of the Armenians were either killed or they just left and moved to Istanbul to be sort of migrant workers or moved abroad if they could. So it's really surprising that in that year where Armenians had left the city, there's actually this huge municipality built by an Armenian architect, and it was funded by the state, and the state invested that much to build this huge municipality. And what I find even more fascinating about it is you can see on this image here, I don't know, oh yeah, you can see with the mouse, that's the municipality. And the municipality is not only made from this wonderful grey tufa, which is this volcanic stone that's widely used in this region and also in Armenia, as we know from Tamanian. So it's built in this beautiful local stone, volcanic stone, of this very distinctive hue, but it's actually constructed so that it's attached to the castle. And the castle was a very important civic symbol for Bitlis because it's supposed to date back to Alexander the Great. And the chronicles of the time, the sort of, what are they called, the imperial yearbooks, the Salnames, describe the importance of the castle for the city, and they describe its genealogy going back to Alexander. And so it's amazing that this Armenian architect sort of tapped into the importance of the castle as a civic symbol and attached his building that was a symbol of, the new modernizing state to that old symbol of the city in that way. And so it occurred to me that, that there are these situations where Armenian architects were actually, rethinking and realigning civic identity in quite interesting ways through their buildings. So I started to connect it to more recent work in Ottoman architectural history, which has been done by Ahmet Ersoy, who's been discussing the architecture of Istanbul or Constantinople. And there was quite a different stylistic development in the 1860s to 1870s, whereby the Ottoman architecture starts to make historical quotations. So it's starting to revive earlier, predominantly Islamic styles and early Ottoman styles, much earlier Ottoman styles. So it starts to make reference to the earliest Ottoman architecture from the sort of golden age of the Ottoman dynasty. So for a really long time this was just sort of written off as a reflection of the conservatism of that period and the change in sultans to Abdulaziz and Abdulhamid II, and that this was a reflection of pan-Islamism and sort of trying to create a more conservative Islamic sentiment through the architecture. But more recently, Ahmet Ersoy has argued that actually this reflects a different approach to history and a sort of revivalist approach to history that the Ottomans were going through at this time. And so I connected this interest in the golden age of the Ottomans and an interest in the past that was seen in Istanbul with what these Armenians were trying to do in their localities. And I was trying to think, if it's possible that in Istanbul, the architects who were by and large Armenians were showing this deep appreciation for historical styles at this time, is it then possible that these provincial architects also had this complex relationship with the past and were reviving it on their own terms in the 19th century? So I tried to find more examples of references to past architecture throughout the Ottoman East or Western Armenia, and this is another example that I found. And does anyone know where this is? It's yes, in Diyarbakir. So this image here is from the Great Mosque of Diyarbakir, right in the centre. And the one on the other side is from Surp-Giragos, which is the Armenian Apostolic Cathedral. And if you look at the memory books by Dikran Spear or Tigran Mukund, which were written about Diyarbakir in the 19th century and published much later in the diaspora, he describes in detail that Surp-Giragos went through a series of rebuildings in the 19th century. It was hit by fires. And so actually a lot of the structure of Surp-Giragos that remains, obviously it's been rebuilt and renovated much more recently, but before that, what was remaining was by and large 19th century, 1880s sort of period, a lot of the decoration of Surp-Giragos and a lot of the architectural features as well. So even though it's an early modern church that goes back probably to 16th century or so, the sort of structure, there were quite big changes that happened in the 1880s due to a series of fires. So some of the elements of Surp-Giragos date most likely from this late 19th century period. I'm not sure about this carving because it does look quite old, so I'd be interested if anyone can date the stone or something. Maybe we need to do some tests on it. But certainly there's a lot of interior furnishings in Surp-Giragos, like these huge altarpieces that you see when you go inside, and they are definitely late 19th century. So a lot of the interior, a lot of the ornament inside is very much a product of the 19th century, despite the impression that it's much older. So I'm interested in this carving, which appears to show a similar composition to the one on the Great Mosque. So it shows a lion and a bull in combat. And this lion and bull combat scene has like an amazing genealogy that goes back to both medieval Armenian architecture. You can see it in medieval Armenian churches in Armenia itself. And you can also see it in medieval Islamic architecture going back to all over the place. So you can see it in also in Assyrian stuff, and you can see it in Islamic Spain, and there's a huge reproduction of this motif. It was popular both in Islamic and in Christian iconography. And there are different interpretations of what it means. So it can mean like the triumph of the dynasty, and it can mean sort of the arrival of a new king or the supremacy of the royal family. Or there are various different interpretations of what it means in the Islamic setting. So how do we interpret what it's doing here? And why would you find a version of the carving on the Great Mosque of Diyarbakir on St. Gregor's Church? It's always been a puzzle. And how do we work out, what it could have possibly meant in the 19th century when it was perhaps made? So I started to go back and think about the perceptions of the Great Mosque itself amongst 19th century Armenians. And apparently in the late 19th century there was a circulating story that the Great Mosque was originally a palace, and that palace was the palace of Tigranes, so that the great sort of emperor of Tigrana-Serta. So at that time it was believed that Diyarbakir was this great Armenian capital. And so it was believed that the Great Mosque was on the same site as the palace of Tigran's palace. So recent excavations, it's interesting because actually the Great Mosque hasn't been excavated until quite recently, because it's a mosque and obviously you need certain permission to do that. And so it's taken a long time to discover what was actually originally on the site. There were some theories going back to early studies of the Great Mosque that were done by architectural historians in the 19th century, that it was on the site of a Roman theatre, and then after the Roman theatre it became a church, and so there were 19th century archaeologists and academics who were also promoting this idea that there were former buildings on the site of the Great Mosque that were non-Muslim, and perhaps Christian, and perhaps before that classical. So the idea that it was also the palace of Tigran was not completely crazy at the time. And then another thing that it says in the memory books, so particularly these ones by Tigran Mekunt, who was a former resident of Diyarbakir and then he moved to the States, he also describes that these carvings on the churches and also on the citadel were classical carvings, and that they were much older than the mosque itself, or they were much older than the church. And so this also suggests that there was this idea that although those carvings occurred on a mosque, they had a much older antiquity and they were used again on the church. So again, I thought it was interesting that through their buildings, Armenians were making reference to a much earlier period in the city's history, and they were somehow sort of appropriating it in a way through aspects of their architectural decoration in their own churches. And it was almost a claim that before the Ottomans, before the Great Mosque even, there were Armenians here, and they built a palace, and it was the greatest palace in the history of architecture. And this was a reminder of that, perhaps, for those Armenians. So again, it was like a link to this former period of Armenian greatness before Islam. But at the same time, you can also just interpret it as they were using the same motif that they saw in the Great Mosque, and actually that shows that they were, loyal Christians under an Islamic empire. So it could be interpreted in many different ways. So that's the difficulty really that we have, that you can find this genealogy that tells you about this Armenian greatness, but you can also go the other way and interpret it in terms of its Islamic symbolism and a sort of message of loyalty by these Armenians who were under threat at that time, because they just had a series of fires that destroyed everything in the cathedral. So, as I said, there are 6 chapters, so there are many examples that I could go through. I'm not going to go through every one, but I thought this was another interesting one that I would mention to you, because it's perhaps a less specific one, and to anybody who's been to Urfa or Odessa, you would notice that nearly all of the buildings have this very distinctive style of arch, which is called an ogive arch or ogival arch, I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly. So it's distinctive because, if I can show you, on this one it's perhaps the clearest. So it has this sort of tripartite structure where you've got this upper arch and then these lower bits, and it's slightly sort of tripartite in the way that it's arranged, but it has a pointed arch at the top. And sometimes the shape is more exaggerated than others, but generally it's characterised by this pointy arch that's almost sort of slightly bulbous. So that is a distinctive arch that most architectural historians associate it with Islamic architecture, and it's viewed to be a sort of typical motif of Islamic architecture now. But in this period, it was actually imported to Urfa, Odessa, largely through the Crusades. So to the inhabitants who were living in the 19th century, particularly to Armenians, it may have actually communicated a Christian antiquity instead of the sort of Islamicizing style that we associate it with today. And again, if you revisit the memory books, there's a brilliant memory book that was written or compiled in the 1950s. Sorry, I haven't explained fully what these memory books are. Memory books are, they're called Hushamadian in Armenian, and they were books that were sort of compilations. By and large, they were sort of multi-authored compilations. And they were trying to bring together usually different articles or different chapters about different aspects of former cities and villages and towns in the Ottoman Empire that were Armenian. And they were by and large produced in the diaspora, so after the genocide, in the places where Armenians moved to, in Beirut, for instance, or in United States, and they were by and large also produced through compatriotic associations. So they had quite strong links to the places that they came from. There are these books that are widely available in sort of national libraries. If you go to the British Library and type in, Odessa or Urfa, you'll find at least 2 memory books in the British Library that will tell you in Western Armenian, unfortunately, so it's difficult to read them. But they're printed nevertheless, so that helps. And one day we'll have AI to help us as well, although not yet. So they're encyclopedic about the old culture and life of these cities. And so you can actually get quite a lot of information about Urfa from one particular memory book that was written. It was compiled in the 1950s, but a large chunk of it was actually dating from 1881. And it was written by a priest in Urfa called Father Arevian. And he compiled quite a large chunk of it before he died. And so this particular memory book gives us quite a good idea actually about 19th century Urfanian Armenian life. So from books like that, you get a good or a strong impression that a lot of the Urfanian buildings were perceived to be by Armenians former churches. So nearly all the mosques were either built by Armenians or they used to be a church. And nearly all the Islamic motifs, therefore, could be understood to be, motifs associated with churches rather than with mosques. And something that I found of further interest, actually, is that in Urfa, or Odessa, a lot of the Armenian churches were also converted. Many of them used to be Syriac or early Christian churches that were then later converted to Armenian Christianity. And many of them actually housed relics that dated back to the earliest days of Christianity in Urfa. And so there was in Urfa a sense of sort of almost competitive sanctity that these churches were reconstructed in the 19th century. So this one here is the Protestant church, Sup Arakelots, which was built Some say in the 1840s, some say in the 1880s, so there's not clear information about that one. It's kind of conflicting. But the other one, so Astvadzadzin, that was most likely built in the 1840s, so rebuilt considerably. But they both date back to much earlier medieval pre-structures. And they house relics that go back to the earliest days of Christianity. And what I found particularly interesting about Urfa is that these relics are all connected with the Mandylion. Do you know what the Mandylion is? So the shroud so there was a king in Edessa called King Abkar. And King Abkar is now thought to be an Arab, but there are some accounts that say he was Armenian, but they were by and large ruled out, and he's viewed to be Arab. So he was the king of Edessa, and he needed to be convinced about Jesus's existence. And so a shroud was sent to him, a textile was sent to him with an impression of Jesus's face in Edessa. It was sent to Edessa, and it was hidden in a well in Edessa, I think. So there are a couple of different points in the city that are believed to be the former locations of this very holy relic that was this shroud that had the image of Christ on it. And so there were other relics that were also held in Edessa that were linked with this early period of Christianity, such as there was the relics of St. Adai, who was the messenger who brought the shroud, I think. So his relics were not in this church, but in the other Armenian Apostolic Church. So I thought it was also really interesting that all of these Armenian churches were believed to house these very holy relics too. And so they had this unique sanctity, quite unusual for Armenian churches to have these very important early Christian relics. And so again I connected that to this very sort of medievalizing decoration that they implemented in the 19th century. And I thought through using these motifs, through using these ogival arches or ogival arches, they were trying to hark back to this early Christian period and to sort of appropriate it for Armenians and in these churches that were formerly not Armenian, but by the 19th century they were. So that was how I was trying to understand this puzzling motif, but may or may not be convincing. So I've mentioned a few times these memory books. So this is an example in the middle. This is the one about Urfa or Edessa that you can find in the British Library. So I suggest you all go after this and call that one up. As I said, this has this amazing introduction section that's by this Father Arabian, which tells you all about the 19th century and its former struggles of the community. And so it gives you quite an unusual sort of insight into the mindset of the community at that time. What's also interesting about these memory books is they often have things like photographs. Like this is a photograph of the altarpiece of one of the Armenian churches in Urfa or Edessa. And presently there's absolutely nothing in the church because it was all completely burnt down. In the Hamidian massacres, it was just torched. It was the site of, the worst massacres where thousands of people were burned alive. So there's absolutely nothing inside that church, and it was converted into a mosque. It was actually empty for quite a long time, and then later turned into a mosque. So now it doesn't have the altarpiece. There's no trace that it was ever an Armenian church there. And so in the memory book, that was printed in the 1950s, but contains a compilation of materials from various periods since 19th century to the 50s. You can find things like these photographs, and those are the original altarpieces, and they're just phenomenal because they really contrast with this quite austere exterior. This isn't the same church, this is actually a Protestant church, but it's quite similar in terms of the austere exterior that these churches have, and the sole decorative motif really is this ogival, this pointed arch on the exterior. So it's amazing to have these memory books where you have, these original altarpieces that were fantastically elaborate. And they give you a totally different view on the material sort of, let's say, networks of the community, because so many aspects are coming from outside Urfa on these altarpieces. There's these sort of, it's difficult to see on this photo, I wish we could zoom in, but there's these very sort of Baroque sculptural elements that look very much like they're coming from Italy. There's things that are absolutely not locally made in these altarpieces that are, perhaps they were sort of created through local craftsmen, but they were absolutely stylistically looking elsewhere. And they were very much in connection with European Baroque altarpieces. So it's a very different impression from this sort of more traditional exterior that's looking to this sort of Christian sanctity going back to medieval periods. So thank goodness we have these memory books, because otherwise we wouldn't know all these layers. And another great thing about the memory books is that we actually have biographies of architects. So this is an example from Sarafian's memory book that was written about Gaziantep or Aintab. And this is I think it's a 2-volume memory book that's especially rich. And it's got entries by lots of different authors that have contributed to it. And one of the entries is this biography of an architect called Sarkis Kaidegian. And he used to live in Antep in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he was the architect of a number of very important buildings, including the Suk Astvadziadin Cathedral, including the Armenian Catholic Church, including a huge han, or a sort of, let's say, a market sort of storage building for traders that was just outside the city. So he built not only Armenian churches of different denominations, but he also built commercial buildings, and he also built mosques. So we get a huge amount of information from these biographies, even though it's only a couple of pages, that these provincial architects were engaged in a wide range of different works, including not just Christian but Muslim and state and commercial. So we also have, if we're lucky, oral histories. So, for instance, when I was working in Mardin, I was very lucky to be contacted by the relatives of a local architect there, and they told me their family history. And so this architect was a very important figure who had a kind of monopoly in the 19th century and constructed nearly all of the late 19th century houses, state buildings like schools, the government house, and he also built a minaret for the mosque, the Shahidiya Mosque. So there are also many oral histories that remain, out there in the community that can also inform us a great deal about these figures. And I was very lucky to actually be the recipient of one of those. As I mentioned before, we also have down the road from us here in the Kew National Archive a surprising source about local social relations, particularly in the 19th century. So in the 19th century you had British consuls who were stationed in Diyarbakir at what was known as the Kurdistan Consulate, and they were writing pretty much on a daily basis about what was going on around there. Obviously they weren't very interested in describing architecture, so the words of a song that was being sung by Kurdish, what he called sort of Kurdish chieftains and tribesmen in Bitlis in the late 19th century. So just exactly at that time that the municipality was built that I showed you in the beginning. So the British consul took down the words that were being sung by this Kurdish chieftain and his tribe about the government house in Bitlis. And it was all about how, the government house should be burnt down, and it was all, it was really interesting insights about how these government buildings were perceived by different communities at that time. And so you get the picture that there was this loyalist Armenian architect called Arakel Kalfa who was building this, symbol of civic resurgence after the massacres that I showed you before. But on the other hand, you had these Kurdish chieftains who were singing this song about burn down the government house. So it was a very interesting sort of comparison that you could generate there through looking at these different sources. And another one, the one in the middle, is interesting because it's about Andranik, who apparently was being held up in a monastery outside of Bitlis in 1902. This was interesting because it was telling me about the change. I felt like there was a shift from monastic power, where the monasteries started to take on different functions in a way, and that Armenian communities started to use city centre churches more as a focus for, let's say, loyalist or pro-reform elites, and that monasteries perhaps started to have a different role and were maybe hosting revolutionaries or were maybe being closed down because they were printing, and the printing presses were being closed down by the government. So there were lots of shifts in terms of what was important in the architecture of these communities, and there was a shift perhaps away from monasteries more towards city centre churches and different groups that were using these different foundations. So in other words, if they don't tell you that much about specific architectural questions, they do give you very interesting background, so it's worth consulting these sources. As an architectural historian, of course, my main source is the buildings themselves. And I was kind of disappointed when the book came out because the photos don't really do these buildings justice. So that was a reason to go for open access in the end, because I thought, these photographs, I have millions of these photographs from living there and touring around, and the world needs to see these photographs. So when you look at these buildings, you can just see these elements that were absolutely, unfamiliar, absolutely sort of experimental, stylistically, spatially. They were absolutely not traditional. They cannot be classed as traditional architecture in many ways. They were doing some very new things with local buildings in the 19th century, these Armenian architects. So this is an example from Mardin. This is a high school. So this is the school itself here. And it was constructed in the 1890s, I think 1898 or something like that, right at the end of the 1890s. So again, after the Hamidian massacres, but in Mardin, it was quite unusual that the Hamidian massacres actually didn't take place, because there's a number of different reasons why that are put forward, but there's a sort of a story by missionaries that groups of Arab notables kept the Kurdish attackers away from the Armenians. And there are other interpretations that other groups were responsible, so it's not 100% clear exactly what happened, but there were not the massacres that took place elsewhere in the Hamidian period. So Mardin's quite unusual that it doesn't have this sort of resurgence after the massacres, because it wasn't impacted as much as elsewhere. So a lot of the buildings in Mardin were constructed through the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. This was like a really strong period of development there. And as I said before, there was a very influential Armenian architect whose family contacted me, who was called Sarkis Loli. And he constructed nearly all the schools like this one, the government buildings, the mansions, these huge glamorous mansions for Armenian merchants in the city, and some of those Armenians also worked for the state, like they were the head of the treasury and things like that, so they had quite close relations with government. And what was significant about Mardin is that they were all Armenian Catholics, and they'd all converted sometime before. It had started more or less in the 18th century, and by the end of the 19th century they were all Armenian Catholics. So they were all much more connected with Italy, because of that, and also Lebanon, particularly Lebanon by this point. So you can see those connections in their architecture. So even though there are many local features that you can identify, like the use of local Mardinli stone, and you can see a lot of references to the local pre-Islamic, particularly the late antique architecture through these buildings. So for instance, if we go up here to these motifs here, these dentil sort of carvings and the sun rays and things, a lot of these are, and the use of multiple pediments as well is very classicising. So many of these things go back to the late antique heritage of this region of Mesopotamia, which was very rich in classical architecture, which we don't hear about so much because there's been such a priority on Turkification and viewing the Islamic dynasties as this sort of gallop towards the creation of a modern Turkish identity. So the classical heritage has actually been sort of sidelined in this region, but it's very present here in the 19th century. But you have these classical motifs and these sort of entablatures and things that are combined with references to the Italian Renaissance. And this is very much a copy of an Italian Renaissance loggia building, going back to examples in Florence that you can see from the Renaissance, the peak of the Renaissance. This curved stairway is also mimicking the kind of flamboyant stairways that you can find in Renaissance Italy as well, and it's totally unprecedented to find that kind of sweeping staircase in Anatolia. And this photo doesn't really do it justice, but it sweeps round a corner. It's this amazing sort of undulating curve that starts round here and goes round and then up this huge staircase, and it leads up to the school. So it's remarkable that this kind of, all these features of palatial architecture essentially were used for this late 19th century school. And this is the view from the top of the hill. So you're standing just below the medieval castle, the citadel on top of the hill. So Mardin is this sort of terraced city that's above the Mesopotamian plain. So you can see below, that's the Mesopotamian plain and all this greenery. But then the city is sort of stacked on these terraces on this, all around this medieval castle. So you're viewing the school from the castle down, and you can see the size of the platform for the school is huge. And all of this territory where the school was developed, all of the platform, was where there used to be a madrasa. So there used to be an Islamic religious school, and they appropriated the waqf, they appropriated the foundation, and used it for a school, for a secular school, which is also really interesting because you have this Armenian architect who is an agent of the centralization and the modernization of the 19th century, and who is, these kind of schools, this was a high school, these kind of schools were bringing in, the Kurdish sort of, the sort of people from the outside the urban areas and who hadn't had access to education before, and we're bringing them into the modernisation and centralisation of the state. So again, it's a form of conversion in a way that this Armenian architect's involved in. He was a Catholic, he converted, and then he's an agent of the state in converting the Kurdish population of the locality. And he was also involved in building a barracks also just along the street from here, which again is a phenomenal building, which is just this huge facade from the front, from the street where you look at it, and then from the back it has this double story underground, which is supported by these buttresses that are also almost like spiders' legs that are protruding from the back, and they're supporting this underground level that gives it this sleek facade from the front, and then from the back it's just this huge feat of engineering. So there's a lot of very experimental things that are happening in Mardin's architecture at this time, which the photos do not do justice to, unfortunately, so you have to go there. So how do we decode these things, and how do we see what was new, what was old, what was the dialogue with the vernacular, what was coming from Italy, what was coming from Lebanon. So we try as art historians to analyse the motifs, analyse the kind of structures that they're using, and make formal comparisons and build an argument through drawing out these comparisons. So, for instance, I did a lot of travelling around the late antique sites in the region, and this is a niche from Deir el-Zafaran Monastery, which was a late antique monastery that was Syriac. And in the 19th century, Sarkis Loli, this Armenian architect, was actually involved in renovating the monastery. So he was very familiar actually with this late antique monastery. And so you can identify parallels between the classicizing entablatures that you can see here, this kind of double, the use of the double entablature is really interesting that Sarkis Loli uses here and here, and especially in the Armenian Catholic Church in Mardin that I haven't shown here, but he sort of, on the Armenian Catholic Church, he places one of these sort of rectangular entablatures and then another one that's like this on top of it, so he's got two on top. I suppose he's sort of done it there as well. So this is completely unseen in the Islamic medieval architecture of the region, and it's something that's coming from the late antique, and his sort of playing around with that heritage and reinventing it to create something new. So what are the limits of this interpretation that I've tried to put forward? I'm sure you can see lots of limits, but that's fun, I suppose. That's the challenge for the next generation. And part of my aim with this book actually was just to stimulate more scholarship, because as I said for the first half of this presentation, there's been absolutely nothing that's been written about this architecture, and just to get the images out there, to get people to see how fascinating this is and how layered it is and how much research is needed to really understand it, and to do it justice is one of the key aims of this whole venture. So limitations are, it's already quite clear that it wasn't necessarily limited to the territory of the Ottoman East or Western Armenia, although obviously there are demographic reasons why it was more common to see Armenian architects in those regions, because the population of Armenians was much higher. And in some other districts you can see more Greeks. So in Edirne, for instance, in Thrace you can see more Greeks. In central Anatolia you see a mixture, you see quite a lot of Armenians there too. But in the Ottoman East there was definitely a stronger presence of Armenian architects, particularly in the cities that I've looked at. In every one of those cities there are named individuals with Armenian names who are responsible for constructing a whole host of buildings in the 19th century. So they had almost a sort of local construction company that did everything, almost a monopoly. So were there other non-Muslim architects? So it's really hard to find. We're so lucky in Armenian studies in the way that we have these memory books, that they have been preserved, because other communities don't have that. So we don't know anything about Kurdish architects, because they haven't got the memory books. So, for some other parallel communities, there's even less hope of actually tracing what their heritage was and what their contributions were in the 19th century. But there must have been Kurdish architects, I just haven't encountered them. And also we're lucky that Armenian names are distinguishable. So when you see an Arakel, you know that he's Armenian, but it's perhaps less easy to see with Arabic names and with Armenian Catholics and those who took on less distinguishing names. Also there's so much more work to do in terms of the networks. And I didn't use, for instance, the Propagandae Fide archives, which would tell you so much, I'm sure, about the networks between Rome and Mardin. I've seen a few references to Armenian architects from Mardin being trained in Italy, but I've never found anything to back that up. So perhaps if more archival work was done by those who knew Italian and who had connections in Italy, then you might be able to find that evidence. Also, other networks in other cities, so there seemed to be a stronger connection in Bitlis or in Erzurum in the other direction, in the Caucasus in Russia. So again, a lot more source work is needed with people with other languages. There's so much also published in Lebanon in Arabic that's all about Mardin and all about its churches and all about its Christian heritage there. So there's a lot of potential for people with other linguistic skills to delve more deeply into this. What directions are there for further study? There are a lot of architects that we only have the names for, so as I said, sometimes you're lucky and you get 2 pages of a biography in a memory book, but more often you just have a name. So luckily we have, in the Urfa memory book, we have a lot of mentions of this guy called Usta Harab, who built a number of private residences, government buildings and churches in the 19th century, so we get an idea that he was very active, but we don't know anything else about him yet. So there are a couple of Ottoman documents that mention him too, but it's very difficult to get more sort of background about, unless we're lucky and some family member appears someday, then it's quite challenging to find out more about these figures. And there's the challenge of Van. So I didn't include Van in my book because there's nothing there from the 19th century. So we're very lucky that, for Mardin, for Urfa, for other cities, there are a lot of buildings, there are churches, there are mansions and other structures that do remain, but for that, there are not that many even photographs that show the 19th century architecture, so those are really challenging locales to endeavour to sort of recreate in any kind of detail. So yeah, that's it really. Just that you have resources. You have the National Archive down the road. You have the British Library and the memory books, and more memory books are being digitised and put on archive.org. So you can also access them on the internet. You also have photograph archives that are online, like the Mapping Mesopotamia archive by Columbia, which has a lot of photos of Mardin and other places. The Abdulhamid II photograph album is a great resource for looking at the government buildings in different localities. So you can do a search for, Erzurum or whatever, and it will show you government houses, schools, and whatever else that was in that album. So that was a very famous photograph album that was sent by the Sultan Abdulhamid II to different libraries around the world. So he sent one to the British Library, one to the Library of Congress, and so on. So it was a huge state project to document the Ottoman Empire at that time and to be a sort of source of propaganda. So you can look at that and look at Hushamadian as well.